In the quiet suburb of N. City, the morning of October 15, 2020, began with a tragic event. Kate Sullivan, a 35-year-old nurse and wife of police detective Jake Sullivan, was found dead in their family home. At first glance, it seemed like just another murder, with possible motives ranging from robbery to jealousy or revenge. However, as the investigation progressed, unexpected facts began to emerge, pointing to a tangled web of family secrets and an equally shocking suspect. Jake and Kate had been married for 10 years, often seen as the perfect couple. Their marriage was frequently held up as an example to others, a strong bond built on love, trust, and mutual respect. But, as it turned out, behind the closed doors of their home was a completely different story. A story of forbidden passion, betrayal, and lies involving someone from Jake's past, his own brother, Max. The brothers hadn't spoken in years due to an old conflict and lingering resentment. Now, their feud was reigniting with new intensity, threatening not only to shatter their already fragile family ties, but also to lead to devastating consequences. Driven by grief and anger, Jake begins his own hunt for Max, walking a fine line between the law and risking everything he has. This story, full of unexpected twists, makes us question: how well do we really know our loved ones? What secrets might hide behind the masks of respectability? And is there a limit to what a person will do for revenge and personal justice? Let's try to find the answers as we delve into the dark details of Kate Sullivan's life and death. Jake Sullivan and Kate Moore met in 2008 in New York City. He had just graduated from the police academy and started working in the homicide division. She was a nurse at a local hospital. Their encounter happened when Jake found himself in a hospital bed after being injured in a shootout. Kate took care of the young officer, and a relationship blossomed between them. 2 years later, the couple got married. At first, Jake and Kate's marriage seemed flawless. They complemented each other. He was strong and decisive, while she was compassionate and understanding. Jake quickly moved up the career ladder, earning a reputation as a principled and determined detective. Kate supported her husband, never complaining about the endless overtime and late-night calls. They dreamed of having children, but due to medical reasons, they were unable to conceive, which became a shared source of pain. In contrast to their happy family life were Jake's difficult relations with his brother, Max. Being 5 years older, Jake had always felt responsible for his wayward and impressionable younger brother. Max had been a troubled teenager, getting involved with questionable crowds and refusing to listen to Jake's advice. Jake had repeatedly pulled Max out of bad situations, covering for his misdeeds in front of their parents, hoping that one day Max would straighten out. But instead, Max got involved with drugs and started stealing to pay off his debts. When Jake found out, he once again tried to reason with his brother. But in a heated moment, Max accused Jake of always thinking he was better and never truly understanding him. Hurtful words escalated into a physical fight, and after that, the brothers stopped speaking altogether. Jake had a hard time dealing with the rift, but convinced himself that he had done the right thing. The last time he saw Max was 5 years ago, at their mother's funeral. Through all of this, Kate had been by Jake's side, comforting him and preventing him from shutting down emotionally. Jake shared his deepest thoughts only with her, or so he thought. Looking back now, he realized that Kate had also been hiding something. Sometimes, he would find her lost in thought, slow to respond to his words. Occasionally, in the middle of the night, she would step out of the room to make an urgent call to the hospital. Jake never questioned her, blindly trusting his wife and not wanting to push. Now, he regretted that trust. They had lived in harmony for 10 years, making plans and sharing joys and sorrows. But then, one phone call shattered the carefully constructed world Jake had built, plunging him into a whirlpool of pain and anger. A call that informed him his beloved wife was dead, and that this wasn't just a murder, it was a deliberate strike to his very core. At 7:30 a.m. on October 15, 2020, a 911 call was made by the Sullivans' neighbor, Mary Porter. She reported that while retrieving her morning paper, she saw through the living room window of the house across the street a woman lying on the floor, showing no signs of life. 10 minutes later, Police and paramedics arrived at the scene. They discovered the body of 35-year-old Kate Sullivan, showing clear signs of a violent death. The medical examiner preliminarily estimated the time of death to be between 10 p.m. and 12 a.m. the previous night. The cause of death was multiple stab wounds. At that moment, Jake was on his night shift at the station. His partner, Steve Burke, called him gently to break the tragic news. Jake dropped everything and rushed home. Seeing the house cordoned off by police and his wife's body on a stretcher, he staggered, unable to believe what was happening. Burke barely caught him in time. Police Captain Ron Sheffield, a seasoned cop trained in Chicago, took charge of the investigation. Understanding Jake's emotional state, he suggested Jake take some time off. But Jake flatly refused, insisting that he had to find his wife's killer himself. Reluctantly, Sheffield agreed, but only on the condition that Jake would work alongside Burke and that they would both report directly to him. The first step was to question the neighbors. It was revealed that around 9:30 p.m. on October 14th, an unfamiliar car had pulled up to the Sullivans' home. Neighbor Bill Young remembered the first 3 digits of the license plate, 476. Jake immediately assigned someone to run the plate through the system. Jake's colleagues began examining Kate's social circle, co-workers, friends, and former boyfriends, searching for anyone who might have had a reason to harm her. But everyone consistently said the same thing. Kate was kind, caring, and had no enemies, an ideal wife and an exemplary employee. This only deepened Jake's sorrow. It was even more painful for Jake to inspect the house, which had turned overnight from a family haven into a crime scene. In the living room, a bouquet of wildflowers still lay on the table, the same bouquet Jake had given Kate the day before the tragedy. The very thought that he had been on duty while his beloved was bleeding to death tore his heart apart. But the real blow was yet to come. Burke brought the results from the license plate search. The car was registered to Max Sullivan, Jake's own brother, the same brother he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. When Jake saw the familiar name, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Could Max really be involved in Kate's death? But why? For what reason? The questions multiplied after reviewing footage from nearby surveillance cameras. The video clearly showed Max entering the house with Kate late that evening. He stayed there for no more than half an hour. When Max left, he appeared agitated, nervously glancing around. Jake didn't know what to think. He hoped his brother could explain everything, that this was some sort of bizarre coincidence. But his instincts told him otherwise. This was just the beginning of his worst nightmare. The interrogation of Max Sullivan was tense. Jake insisted on being present, although Captain Sheffield opposed it. When the brothers faced each other for the first time in 5 years in the interrogation room, a heavy silence filled the air, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Max looked terrible, gaunt, pale, with dark circles under his eyes. But there was no remorse in his expression, more the look of a cornered animal. His answers were scattered and reluctant. Yes, he had been with Kate that evening. He had stopped by to discuss something. No, he wouldn't share what they talked about. It was personal. Jake began to boil inside at Max's evasiveness. He wanted to grab his brother, slam him against the wall, and force the truth out of him. But Sheffield motioned for Jake to calm down, signaling that he was in charge here. The captain skillfully shifted tactics, switching between authoritative pressure and feigned friendliness. Gradually, Max began to crack. It turned out that a few months ago, he had reconnected with Kate. He had run into her at a shopping mall, and they had started chatting. Kate was happy to see him and asked about his life. She said Jake was deeply hurt by their falling out. They exchanged phone numbers and started talking occasionally. Then it escalated into something more. Max confessed that he and Kate had been having an affair. Secret meetings, long conversations, wild sex. He found a kindred spirit in Kate, something he had been missing all these years. And she told him that the spark with Jake was gone, that she was unhappy in her marriage. They even made plans for Kate to file for divorce so they could start a new life together. On that fateful night, Max had gone to urge Kate to leave Jake immediately, not to wait until morning. But suddenly, she began to have doubts, saying she needed time to think. An argument broke out between them. In a fit of rage, Max said some hurtful things, accusing Kate of being a coward and a hypocrite. Kate broke down in tears and told him to get out. He slammed the door and left, thinking they'd make up in the morning. But by morning, Kate was already dead. After hearing his brother's confession, Jake couldn't hold back any longer. He leapt up, knocking his chair over, and charged at Max in a fury. Burke and Sheffield barely managed to pull him off. They dragged Jake out of the room, ignoring his furious protests. The captain knew he had made a mistake by allowing Jake to be present. While Burke tried to calm Jake down, Sheffield wearily sat across from Max. It was clear from his face that he was uncomfortable with the situation, but he had to get to the truth. After going over the details again, the captain asked the key question. What had Max done after leaving Kate's house? Max replied that he went to a 24-hour bar and drank until morning. The bartender, Stanley Miller, could vouch for him. The police verified Max's alibi. The bartender confirmed his story. Surveillance footage from the bar showed that Max had indeed stayed there all night, without leaving for a moment. Phone records didn't reveal anything suspicious. Max voluntarily submitted to DNA testing and provided all the necessary samples. Despite the affair with his brother's wife, there was no concrete evidence linking Max to the crime. He had a motive, jealousy, anger, resentment, but no opportunity. This left the investigation at a dead end. But for Jake, it was just the beginning of his obsession. He couldn't accept that someone he had once trusted could betray him so cruelly. He couldn't fathom how Kate, his sweet Kate, could have had an affair with Max. Jake shut down, barely eating or sleeping. He spent days and nights at the station, poring over the case files, searching for any inconsistency. Burke watched with growing concern as his friend spiraled deeper into self-destruction. But every attempt to reason with Jake was met with a wall of silent despair. Jake only repeated one thing: Max had to pay for taking away the most important thing in his life. And no laws would stop him. Days passed, and the investigation into Kate Sullivan's murder stalled. Every lead led nowhere, witnesses were inconsistent, and physical evidence provided nothing new. It felt as if the killer had vanished without a trace. This lack of progress drove Jake to madness. He walked around like a storm cloud, snapping at colleagues over the smallest things. Captain Sheffield had called him in multiple times, demanding he get a grip, but Jake just brushed him off, convinced he knew the truth. And that truth was that the killer was his brother, and he was still walking free. A relentless obsession grew inside Jake's mind. He had to expose Max at any cost. He became consumed with tracking his brother's every move, looking for any incriminating evidence. Jake combed through Max's phone records, emails, and bank accounts. He tailed him everywhere, taking pictures of who he met with. Burke, watching his partner lose control, tried to reason with him. He insisted that Max, no matter how despicable, wasn't a murderer. Max had an airtight alibi, and no one in the precinct doubted that. He urged Jake to let go, to move on with his life. But Jake refused to listen. One day, Jake's patience snapped. He saw Max leaving a strip club, arm in arm with some girl, and remembered how just recently Max had sworn love to his wife. Fury flared inside him. Jake stormed into the club, grabbed Max by the collar, and began shaking him, shouting accusations in his face. Max tried to defend himself, saying Jake misunderstood everything. But Jake was beyond reasoning. He wanted only one thing: to hurt him. He raised his fist, ready to strike, but suddenly felt someone twist his arm from behind. It was Burke, who had been following Jake, sensing trouble. Together, they wrestled the struggling Jake outside. He thrashed, threatening to break every bone in Max's body. Only Burke's sharp remark brought him back to reality. "You're about to lose your badge, you idiot." Jake slumped in his partner's arms, realizing just how close he had come to doing something reckless. That night, sitting on the floor of his empty living room, Jake drank whiskey straight from the bottle, haunted by memories of Kate, her laugh, her scent, her touch. One thought pounded in his head. He had failed her, failed to protect her, and now he had missed another chance for revenge. The helplessness was suffocating. The next morning, Jake was woken by a call from Captain Sheffield, ordering him to report to the station immediately. Jake knew he was in deep trouble. When he arrived, he expected to be chewed out, but the reality was worse. Sheffield announced that Jake was temporarily removed from the case, and worse still, he was ordered to undergo a psychological evaluation. Hearing this, Jake erupted. He shouted that Max had orchestrated this to avoid punishment. He accused Sheffield of being corrupt and incompetent. Finally, he threw his badge on the desk, shouting, "Choke on it!" before storming out, slamming the door behind him. Burke caught up to him in the hallway, trying to calm him down. But Jake dismissed him too. "You're either with me or against me. There's no middle ground." With those words, he stormed toward the exit, fully aware of where he was heading. Without a police badge, without support, without brakes. Max wanted a war, he'd get one. Jake didn't care about the consequences anymore. That evening, Jake stormed into Max's apartment, armed with a gun and a fiery determination. Max met him at the door, clearly expecting this visit. Max had a gun in his hand too. The brothers raised their weapons at the same time, standing still, aiming at one another. The tension in the air was suffocating, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. And that spark came when Max suddenly burst out laughing. His laugh was eerie, nearly insane. Between gasps, he spat out, "You really think I killed Kate? I loved her more than life. It's you. You're the one to blame. You never understood her, never appreciated her. She suffered because of you. You pushed her into my arms." Hearing this, a red haze clouded Jake's mind. His finger twitched on the trigger. A gunshot rang out, followed by another. Jake couldn't tell who fired first, but in that moment, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest. Looking down, Jake saw a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. His legs gave way, and the gun slipped from his weakening grasp. As he fell, he heard Max's scream, "What have I done?" And then the world dissolved into darkness, thick and sticky like tar. Jake's last thought was, "I'm sorry, Kate. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." Waking up was agonizing. Consciousness surfaced in fragments, grasping at snippets of sounds and images. The beeping of medical devices, the smell of medicine, the blur of white coats. The pain, dull and gnawing, seeped into every cell of Jake's body. He slowly pried his eyes open and struggled to focus. A familiar face hovered above him, Steve Burke. His friend and partner looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept for days. When Burke saw Jake was awake, he beamed and squeezed his hand. From Burke, Jake learned that he had been in a coma for nearly a week. The bullet fired by Max had missed his heart by mere millimeters. Only the skill of the doctors had saved his life. Burke spoke little about what had happened in Max's apartment, clearly wanting Jake to rest. It turned out that Max had called 911 himself and surrendered to the police. The gun he used was registered and legal. Given that Jake had stormed into his home with a weapon, charges against Max were unlikely. His actions would probably be classified as self-defense. This news hit Jake like a sledgehammer. It felt as if everything he had gone through was for nothing. Kate was still dead, and her killer was free. Meanwhile, Jake had become a criminal, crossing the line he had sworn to uphold. The bitter irony and sense of defeat suffocated him. Jake spent the next few weeks in the hospital, recovering his strength and reflecting on what had happened. Burke, Captain Sheffield, and even former colleagues visited, offering their sympathy and support, telling him not to blame himself. But Jake did blame himself, for Kate, for how far he had fallen, for letting his obsession consume him. From the captain, Jake learned that he had gotten off with only a suspended sentence and mandatory therapy. He was lucky. His service record and the tragic circumstances had played a part. But there was no hope of returning to the force. His badge was lost forever. After leaving the hospital, Jake's first stop was the cemetery, where Kate was buried. He sat by her grave for hours, indifferent to the cold autumn wind. His mind replayed their happiest moments over and over. He asked why she had done it, begged her for forgiveness. But the only response was the deafening silence. One day, after returning from another therapy session, Jake found Max standing at his door. Max looked no better, thin, with lifeless eyes. Jake tensed, expecting another confrontation. But Max simply handed him an envelope. Inside was a letter from Kate, written the night she died. In it, she confessed to being confused about her feelings, admitting that she had loved both of them, each in different ways. She said she had wanted to run away, to start fresh, but realized she couldn't escape herself. In the end, Kate asked them to forgive her and let her go. As Jake read the tear-stained letter, he suddenly realized neither he nor Max had ever truly known Kate. She was far more complex than either of them had understood, and her demons were stronger than they could have imagined. Perhaps leaving this world had been her choice, her decision, and there was no one to blame but fate itself. Max, who had been standing silently the whole time, finally spoke. "She loved you, you know. Really loved you. Things just turned out the way they did. We all messed up." And for the first time, Jake agreed with him. They had all messed up, in their love, in their hate, in their blindness. And the cost had been too high. That evening, for the first time in years, the brothers talked, without anger or accusations. They spoke about Kate, about the past, about the pain that had torn their souls apart. It wasn't a reconciliation, but an acknowledgment of shared guilt and loss. As they parted, they shook hands, knowing they would likely never see each other again. A month later, Jake left the city, determined to start a new life. On his last day, he visited Kate's grave, laying her favorite wildflowers on the headstone. "I'm letting you go," he whispered, touching the cold stone. And he could have sworn a warm breeze brushed his cheek, like a gentle kiss. From that moment, Jake Sullivan vanished from sight. Some said he drank himself into oblivion, others claimed he became a private detective. But those who knew him believed he had found his path, a path of redemption, of forgiveness, of finally coming home, to a place where the pain would eventually fade, and the dawn of a new day would rise. Without the past, but with purpose. The story of Jake Sullivan is a tragedy of a man who lost everything in an instant: his beloved wife, his sense of purpose, and his faith in justice. It's a tale of how love and hate, trust and betrayal can distort even the brightest feelings, pushing someone to irreversible actions. Through Jake, we see the destructive power of obsession and blind thirst for revenge. Driven by the pain of loss and anger, he unknowingly becomes a criminal. He crosses the line of the law, betrays his principles, and loses himself. The cost of this choice proves to be unbearably high. At the same time, Jake's story is one of repentance, forgiveness, and redemption. It shows that it is never too late to stop, reflect on one's actions, and try to correct mistakes. Although the path is difficult and long, finding the strength to take the first step is what truly matters. The complex relationship between the brothers, Jake and Max, also played a role in this tragedy. Misunderstandings, mutual grievances, and the lack of honest conversation ultimately led to fatal consequences. Perhaps, if they had found the courage to talk openly sooner, the outcome could have been different. Kate's character, revealed in the final moments, adds ambiguity to the story. Her departure was not just the result of the brothers' rivalry, but also of her own emotional turmoil. Kate is portrayed not just as a victim of circumstance, but as a person with her own demons, doubts, and a desire to break free from suffocating constraints. The main takeaway from this story is that nothing is more dangerous than uncertainty and unspoken truths in relationships with loved ones. The fear of opening up, sharing pain, or discussing problems breeds tragedy. The ability to listen, understand, forgive, and let go of resentment is key to emotional healing. Another crucial message is not to let pain and anger take control of your mind. Revenge, no matter how righteous it may seem, only destroys from within, consuming the soul. True freedom and peace can only be found through acceptance and forgiveness. Despite its tragedy, Jake Sullivan's story offers hope. A hope that everyone can find a path to redemption, a path back to themselves. And while the journey may be difficult, the destination is worth the effort. Step by step, day by day, with faith in a new dawn.